Hey everybody. This is a chapter from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. This chapter is about Trotskyism in the Netherlands, and it's called Trotskyism in the Netherlands. The history of Trotskyism in the Netherlands divides clearly into two parts, before and during after World War II. During most of the first period, the Dutch Trotskyist movement was one of the largest and most important anywhere in the world. It was led by an early leader of the Comintern and was one of the few Trotskyist groups that controlled an important segment of the labor movement and had representatives in the country's legislative bodies. In contrast, after the war, the Trotskyists were a minor factor even in the far left of Dutch politics. The origins of Dutch Trotskyism. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing this guy's name right. Hendrik Sneevliet is how I think he pronounced it, but I usually see it his name's as Henk, like H-E Henk. Dutch to English.
Henk Sneevliet. Henk Sneevliet.
Henk Sneevliet. All right. Origins of Dutch Trotskyism. The early career of Hendrik Sneevliet. When, in 1929, Trotsky began his work of trying to build an international movement, there were few, if any, avowedly Trotskyist individuals or groups in the Netherlands. However, there was an important dissident communist group led by Hendrik Henrius Sneevliet, which was first rejected by Trotsky but later became, for some years, the Dutch affiliate of International Trotskyism. I'm just going to read Sneevliet's Wikipedia intro real quick. Hendrik Josephus Franciscus Modi Sneevliet, known as Henk Sneevliet, Henk, or by the pseudonym Maring, was a Dutch communist politician who was active in both the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. As a functionary of the Communist International, Sneevliet guided the formation of the Communist Party of Indonesia in 1914 and the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. In Sneevliet's native country, he was the founder, chairman, and only representative for the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party, RSP/RSAP. He took part in the communist resistance against the occupation of the Netherlands during World War II by Nazi Germany, for which he was executed by the Germans in April 1942. That's the end of the Wikipedia intro. Hendrik Sneevliet. I'm just going to start to say Henk from now on because that's how I've always seen it. Henk Sneevliet had been born in 1883, year Karl Marx died, and before Sneevliet was 20 years of age had joined both the Railroad Workers Union and the Social Democratic Party. In 1913, Sneevliet moved to Java in the Netherlands East Indies, where he took the lead in establishing the Social Democratic Union. After Sneevliet was expelled from the East Indies by the Dutch authorities, Sneevliet's associates there converted the Social Democratic Union into the Indonesian Communist Party in 1920. Under the name of Maring, Sneevliet represented the Indo-Chinese Communists at the Second Congress of the Communist International in Moscow in 1920, and was elected there to the Executive Committee of the Comintern. In the following year, Sneevliet was sent by the Comintern to China, where Sneevliet attended the founding Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and met subsequently with Sun Yat-sen. After 2 years in China, Sneevliet returned to the Soviet Union and was sent by the Comintern to Vladivostok. In mid-1923, Sneevliet returned for a short visit to China. By the middle of 1924, Sneevliet finally returned to the Netherlands, where Sneevliet became one of the major leaders of the Communist Party and head of a trade union organization controlled by the party, the NAS. However, as a result of his support of the left opposition in the internal struggle within the Soviet Union, Sneevliet withdrew from the Communist Party in 1927. In 1929, Sneevliet set up the Revolutionary Socialist Party. Next section. The evolution of Trotsky-Sneevliet relations. Between 1929 and 1933, relations between Trotsky on the one hand and Sneevliet and his party on the other were not particularly friendly. The issue which kept them apart was the insistence of Sneevliet and the Revolutionary Socialist Party that there was no hope of, quote, reforming, end quote, the Comintern and its constituent parties, and that it was necessary to establish rival communist parties and a new international. Until mid-1933, Trotsky and Trotsky's followers were insisting that they were an, quote, opposition, end quote, faction of the Communist International. Trotsky's early attitude towards Sneevliet and his followers was reflected in a letter which Trotsky sent to the Executive Committee of the Communist League of France in June 1930, protesting against an announcement by La Vérité that an article by Sneevliet would soon be published. Quote, one should have thought that it wasn't even necessary to raise the question of collaboration with Sneevliet among us. We do not break with the communist centrist in order to enter into collaboration with the confusionists of the 2.5 International, end quote. The editors of the English language collection of Trotsky's writings have observed that they are, quote, unable to explain why Trotsky in 1930 called Sneevliet, quote, one of the leaders of the 2.5 International, end quote. The 2.5 International was dissolved in 1923 and Sneevliet never belonged to it. Perhaps Trotsky used the term because Sneevliet's policies in 1930 reminded him of those held by the centrists of the 2.5 International, end quote. Sneevliet's insistence on the need for the establishment of parties outside of the Comintern might well have brought to Trotsky's mind at that point the group of parties outside of either the Socialist or Communist Internationals, which in the early 1920s made up the so-called 2.5 International. A year later, Trotsky continued to be adamantly hostile to Sneevliet and his party. In a memorandum sent to the International Communist League, in which he commented on the various anti-Stalinist communist groups, he claimed, quote, the Brandlerites, which were like the right oppositionists, comparable to like the Lovestonites in the United States, oriented around Bukharin, I believe. I'm not actually sure of the exact history of the right opposition on the international stage, but Robert J. Alexander has a book on that, which I should read. Anyway, quote, the Brandlerites or Bonds, who was like the part of like the German like Lenin Bund, I think was, and Sneevliet, all agree that our policies are sectarian, end quote. Later, Trotsky queried, quote, is it necessary to pause at Sneevliet? Sneevliet swears that he has nothing in common with the Second International, but we don't believe in oaths, ... Can you respect political people who throw dust in the eyes of the workers, ... end quote. However, by early 1933, when Trotsky began to change his own position on the question of remaining a, quote, opposition, end quote, to the Comintern, his attitude toward the Sneevliet group also began to modify. When shortly after the Nazis came to power, the Comintern was planning a world anti-fascist conference in Amsterdam, Trotsky suggested a tactic for his followers at such a meeting. He wrote to the International Secretariat that, quote, "We will have to try to make agreements with organizations such as the Party and the trade unions of Sneevliet in Holland, the SAP in Germany, and other similar organizations," end quote. Obviously, Trotsky was not yet thinking in terms of uniting with the Sneevliet Party in the same organization, but Trotsky had begun to think of the Dutch leader as a possible ally. However, the combined efforts of the Trotskyists and Sneevliet were not very successful at the Amsterdam conference. The resolution they sponsored was defeated by a vote of 2,000 to 6. The RSP and the NAS. The, quote, mass base, end quote, upon which Sneevliet primarily relied was the trade union group, the Nationaal Arbeiders Secretariat, NAS, which had originally been established in 1893. Right after the First World War, the NAS had close to 50,000 members out of a total of about 560,000 trade unionists in the Netherlands. At that time, the NAS's leadership was divided between communist and anarcho-syndicalists. At its 1923 conference, the NAS voted for a narrow majority to affiliate with the Red International of labor unions rather than with the anarcho-syndicalist International Working Men's Association. By the time of Sneevliet's return to the Netherlands in 1924, the NAS was, quote, closely tied to the CPH, end quote, Communist Party of Holland, end quote. Sneevliet was soon elected president of the NAS, which, however, by that time only had about 14,000 members. Nonetheless, the NAS was a genuine trade union group and gave Sneevliet a base in his struggle within the Communist Party, as it was later to give Sneevliet one within International Trotskyism, a base within International Trotskyism. The growing disagreement of Sneevliet and others with the Stalinization of the Comintern led to efforts of the Dutch pro-Stalinist communist leaders who took over the party in 1925 to try to liquidate the NAS into the Social Democratic-controlled Netherlands Verbond van Vakverenigingen. The struggle led to the withdrawal of Sneevliet and his associates from the communist ranks in 1927. Between 1926 and 1929, the Sneevliet group centered on Klassenstrijd, class struggle, a theoretical journal. Then, in 1929, they organized the Revolutionaire Socialistische Partij as a rival to the Communist Party of the Netherlands. That party's abbreviated RSP, and that's what I'm going to be using it. What I'm going to be saying from now on. The RSP won its first major electoral victory in 1933. The RSP won its first major electoral victory. Sneevliet had expressed strong support for sailors who mutinied on the cruiser Seven Provinciën earlier in the year and had been jailed in consequence. However, when Sneevliet was elected to Parliament shortly afterward, the government was forced to release him. By 1933, the RSP had about 1,000 members. The Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party. The establishment of a Dutch section. Sneevliet had gone to Copenhagen to confer with Trotsky during his visit to the Danish capital in November 1932. In the months that followed, the dissident Dutch communists and the Trotskyists moved increasingly close to one another until finally they joined forces. This evolution was due principally to the drastic change in the position of Trotsky and his followers, which resulted in moving the principal barrier which had theretofore existed between Sneevliet and his followers on the one hand and Trotsky and his on the other. In March 1933, after the coming to power of Hitler and the collapse of the German Communist Party, Trotsky had finally come out in favor of the establishment of a rival party to the KPD. By the summer of that year, Trotsky had gone the whole way to argue the need for new communist parties everywhere and for a Fourth International. This was the position which Sneevliet and his associates had long held. This rapprochement was exemplified in various ways. In 1933, Trotsky wrote Jan Frankel with regard to Sneevliet's trial for support of the mutinous sailors, urging that, quote, the press of the opposition must dedicate at least a small article to the courageous conduct of Sneevliet. Sneevliet has shown in this circumstance that Sneevliet is an authentic revolutionary, ... end quote. In the following month, Trotsky again wrote Frankel, urging, quote, the mobilizing of all kinds of sympathizers and semi-sympathizers of our organization, end quote, and suggesting that, quote, the organization of Sneevliet could send a special delegation on the question of Rakovsky, Victor Serge, and others on the one hand, and Chen Du-shu on the other. Christian Rakovsky was a Russian oppositionist. Victor Serge also was, but I don't know if he's. I don't think he was still in Russia at this point. Maybe he was. And Chen Du-shu was one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party and the leader of the Chinese Trotskyists. Referring to campaigns on behalf of prisoners of the Stalinist and Chiang Kai-shek regimes. In August 1933, Sneevliet met at some length with Trotsky in France. At the same time, Sneevliet and Trotsky and Jakob Walcher decided to issue, in one form or another, that what came to be known as the Declaration of the Four in favor of the establishment of a new international. Trotsky reported to Max Shachtman that, quote, Sneevliet was in my home and we were in accord on everything, end quote. Trotsky also wrote Shachtman that Sneevliet had agreed that the Dutch RSP would join the international left opposition, an event which in fact occurred on September 21st, 1933. Trotsky added that, quote, that, quote, means 950 members in support in the form of a trade union organization of 23,000 members, end quote. With the affiliation of the RSP with the ICL, Sneevliet became a member of the International Secretariat. The RSP was only one of two Dutch organizations which signed the Declaration of the Four. The other was the Independent Socialist Party. The OSP. The origins of the OSP and RSP were quite different, and the task of merging them into a single section of the international Trotskyist movement proved a rather difficult one. The OSP was formed as a result of a left-wing schism in the Dutch Social Democratic Labour Party in 1932. It had two principal leaders, Peter J. Schmidt and Jacques Descartes, K-A-D-T. Schmidt had until 1932 always been a social democrat, although editor since 1928 of a left-wing journal of the party, De Socialist. Descartes, on the other hand, had been a founding member of the Communist Party, but had quit the Communist Party in 1929 and founded his own group, the Bond van Communistische Strijd and Propagandaclub, BSKP. In 1929, the BKSP had merged into the Social Democratic Labour Party, and Descartes had become a co-editor of De Socialist. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't know any Dutch, but I'm just kind of making the perhaps erroneous assumption that it's similar to German in pronunciation. Within the OSP leadership, Descartes was clearly opposed to his parties becoming part of an international dominated by Trotsky and his followers. Rather, he apparently hoped to convert the London Bureau, IAG, containing the British Independent Labour Party, Norwegian Labour Party, the SAP of Germany, and other groups, into the new Fourth International. Throughout the latter part of 1933 and the early months of 1934, Trotsky polemicized with Descartes, accusing Descartes of, quote, centrism. In the middle of 1934, Descartes and his supporters left the OSP, thus facilitating the unification of the OSP and the RSP. The merger of the RSP and OSP finally took place on March 3, 1935, with the formation of the Revolutionäre Sozialistische Arbeiterspartie, Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party, RSAP. As Trotsky wrote to James Cannon shortly before the unification of the two groups, it had taken place under somewhat peculiar circumstances insofar as the international Trotskyist movement was concerned. Quote, the OSP, which will form the majority of the membership of the new party, belonged to the IAG before the amalgamation and is not inclined to give up its affiliation to this body. Therefore, our section of the new party will also come into this organization. At the same time, the leaders of the new party want to arrive at some sort of personal basis of unity with the International Communist League. The idea is that the leaders of both groups, Sneevliet and Schmidt, become members of the International Secretariat, It would be absolutely false, however, for us to make withdrawal from the IAG a condition for the establishment of the new party. Further experience will soon show whether the continued affiliation of the Dutch party to this thoroughly confused and centrist organization can be of any good use. End quote. This ambiguous relationship of the Dutch section of the Trotskyist movement with the London Bureau was to continue so long as the RSAP continued to constitute the Dutch section of international Trotskyism. It was indeed to become one of the principal factors determining the ultimate withdrawal of the RSAP from the international Trotskyist movement. The RSAP was, in Trotskyist terms, at least a party of some significance. It not only controlled the NAS trade union group, but also had some influence within the Socialist Democratic NVV Labor Federation in which the OSP had operated. It was likewise active in organizations of the unemployed, where the OSP had in 1934 been influential in a, quote, revolt, end quote, of those without work. The RSAP also had a youth socialist organization, the Revolutionäre Sozialistische Jugendverband, RSJV, founded at a Congress on March 24, 1935. Although Trotsky boasted that it had 5,000 members, it in fact apparently had about 500. The RSAP had some modest electoral influence. Aside from its member of parliament, Sneevliet, it also had some representation at other levels. In municipal elections held about 4 months after the formation of the party, it was reported that, quote, the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party made an excellent showing, electing their candidates in many cities. The RSAP now commands a total of 20 seats in various municipal administrations, an increase of 9 over the last election, end quote. The alienation of the RSAP from international Trotskyism. The Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party was not to remain for long as the Dutch section of the international Trotskyist movement. Within a year of the establishment of the RSAP, there were clear indications that it was being alienated from the International. A number of issues arose between Sneevliet and his associates in the Dutch party on the one hand, and Trotsky and the International Secretariat on the other. The most important of these were relations with the London Bureau, attitudes towards the Spanish Civil War, the question of officially founding the Fourth International, and the trade union policies of the Netherlands Party. However, even before the unification of the RSP and the OSP to establish the RSAP, it was clear that Trotsky had considerable disagreement with the leaders of both Dutch groups on the issues which were to arise with the RSAP. For instance, he told Walter Hold in November 1933, quote, that the trade union question, such as it exists in Holland, has not been discussed. Even if it should be revealed that we have divergences on this question with Comrade Sneevliet, it would be totally inopportune to take up this question now, because it would aid the opportunist elements of the OSP against Sneevliet and his friends. ... End quote. Similarly, in February 1935, Trotsky wrote Sneevliet about the relations with the London Bureau, IAG, quote, "The ICL must maintain for itself complete freedom of movement and criticism with regard to the Amsterdam Bureau. That we should change our attitude towards the IAG after the Paris Conference, I for one consider well nigh impossible. Shall we have to change our minds in the future? The future itself will instruct us as to that. ... End quote. These and other issues did not go away with the unification of the two Dutch groups aligned with international Trotskyism. This became clear in a long letter which Trotsky wrote to the Central Committee of the RSAP in July 1936. It dealt with virtually all of the issues which were to bring about a break of the RSAP with international Trotskyism. In this letter, dated July 15th to 16th, 1936, Trotsky was discussing a forthcoming meeting of the International, which the RSAP had expressed certain reservations about attending. He went over various questions which the Dutch had raised. The first concerned the London Bureau. Quote, "It seems to you superfluous to have to adopt a position toward the London Bureau at the conference. Under no circumstances can I express my agreement with this. The worst obstacles for us, the most malignant enemy, is the London Bureau and the London Bureau's affiliated organizations. Your cartoonist, whom I always admire, recently depicted the Second and Third Internationals as two dogs let loose upon the Fourth International by imperialism. Unfortunately, he forgot to present the small mangy cur who scampers around our legs, snarls at us, snaps at our heels, and seeks by this to prevent us from finishing off the big dogs. This is no subordinate question. Many leading Dutch comrades believe they can be of service to the Fourth International by contact with the London Bureau, that is, by collaboration with the London Bureau and not by means of unremitting struggle against the London Bureau. For a great number of comrades, however, contact with the London Bureau signifies nothing but a break with the Fourth International. I consider it absolutely necessary to bring to the attention of the Dutch comrades this deep-going difference of opinion before the Dutch comrades adopt their final decision." End quote. Trotsky also dealt with the question of the Spanish POUM, the POUM, a party forged by a merger of Andres Nin and the former Trotskyist group there with the right opposition Bloc Obrero y Campesino, led by Joaquin Marin. Quote, "I now come to Spain. In one of his most recent letters, Comrade Sneevliet, in the name of the Central Committee of the party, took up the defense of the Marin-Nin party against my allegedly exaggerated or too sharp attacks. This appears to me to not only unjustified, but also incomprehensible. ... End quote. Trotsky went on to say, quote, "At the moment when Nin's bankruptcy became clear even to his own supporters, he united with the nationalist Catalonian Philistine, Marin, breaking off all relations with us by the declaration that, quote, the International Secretariat understands nothing of Spanish affairs." End quote. In reality, Nin understands nothing of revolutionary policy or of Marxism. End quote. Trotsky then turned to the RSAP itself. Trotsky said that, quote, "The great weakness of the Dutch party seems to me to be the lack of a program of action. For more than a year we have had an exchange of opinions with Sneevliet on this score. Insofar as I may permit myself a judgment, the agitation of the party seems to me to rest far too much upon personal improvisations, upon impressions of the day or week, and therefore bears a dispersed, diluted, and not a concentrated character. ... End quote. The continued existence of the small NAS trade union group under RSAP control particularly annoyed Trotsky. Quote, On the trade union question, too, I cannot share the policy of our fraternal Dutch party. I see no place for the NAS. When the great strike wave began in Holland, which should be regarded as highly probable if not certain, when the great strike wave begins in Holland, which should be regarded as highly probable if not certain, the reformist trade unions will grow mightily and absorb fresh elements into their ranks. And in such a period, the NAS will appear to the masses as an incomprehensible splinter organization. In consequence, the masses will also become unreceptive to the correct slogans of the RSAP and the leadership of the NAS. But if all the members of the RSAP and the best NAS elements were inside the reformist trade unions during the impending upsurge, they could become the axis of crystallization of the left wing and later on the decisive force in the labor movement, ... End quote. At this point, Trotsky clearly was not desirous of a break with Sneevliet and the RSAP. Trotsky ended his letter by saying that, quote, "There are my explanations, dear comrades. I greatly regret that I cannot meet with you, ... for I am certain that a personal discussion would eliminate every shadow of discord between us. But even without my presence, the conference will surely eliminate the accumulated misunderstandings and create better conditions for further collaboration. In this spirit, I extend you my hand in all friendship and wish you the best of success." End quote. Sneevliet finally attended the conference for the Fourth International, which met from July 29th to 31, 1936. He expressed strong opposition to any move to establish the Fourth International in the proximate future. After the first day, Sneevliet left the conference in protest against the inclusion on the agenda of the meaning of a resolution on the trade union question. The resolution, which clearly was a criticism of the trade union policy of the RSAP, maintained that, quote, "to not have within the reformist unions and thus in the factories all disposable forces would be the equivalent of rendering them insignificant, of compromising the Fourth International," end quote. It added that it was the obligation, quote, "of all the organizations of the Fourth International, ... to intervene systematically and intensely in the reformist union, to consider this work as their primordial task," end quote. The break between the RSAP and the Fourth International. One second. There's a name here. I want to see how to pronounce it. I've said this name in other videos, but I don't remember if I said it right.
Georges Viereken. Georges Viereken.
Okay, Georges Viereken. The break between the RSAP and the Fourth International. Georges Viereken. Is that right? Viereken?
Georges Viereken.
Georges Viereken maintained that shortly after the conference for the Fourth International, Trotsky decided to break with Sneevliet and the leadership of the RSAP. When Erwin Wolf, Trotsky's secretary, left Norway for Brussels early in September 1936, Erwin Wolf was commissioned by Trotsky to undertake to engineer the break under conditions which would be as favorable as possible for the Fourth International. Wolf put forth his plan for undermining Sneevliet and splitting the RSAP in a letter dated December 18, 1936, which Wolf wrote to two members of the German IKD who were then resident in the Netherlands. Viereken reproduced parts of that letter. Quote, "That the struggle against Sneevliet is inevitable, there is no doubt. But when one has used, quote, to, end quote, for many years, one cannot suddenly and without preparation publicly denounce the, quote, Dutch muddler," end quote. "We must not forget that if we know of what Sneevliet is guilty, the rank and file of the different parties don't know anything. In the struggle against Sneevliet, we must above all have them on our side, ... If this is going to the point of a definitive rupture, we have to be left with something in Holland. Right now we have virtually no support, ... We have to occupy ourselves with the youth, for the older people seem to be completely under the influence of Sneevliet ... In spite of all, we should be able to do something with the youth ... Only after we have prepared the ground by artillery fire will we sound the assault. End quote. Georges Viereken. By the middle of 1937, the RSAP had definitely broke with the International Secretariat. Among the issues which brought the split were the refusal of the RSAP to send its youth group into the Young Social Democrats, the refusal to merge the NAS into the Social Democratic Trade Union Group NW, and strong support by the RSAP for the Spanish Party of Marxist Unification in the face of continuing severe criticism of the Party of Marxist Unification by Trotsky and the International Secretariat. A resolution of the founding conference of the Fourth International noted, quote, the final departure of such alien elements as Sneevliet and Viereken. Wait, that was just the guy who was like talking about splitting with Sneevliet. With the break of the RSAP with international Trotskyism, a small minority remained as associated with the Fourth International. A group of German Trotskyists in Antwerp and a few Flemish members of the Belgian Party helped these dissidents to publish a journal of their own. The dissidents had established what they called the Bolshevik-Leninist group, which Pierre Neville reported to the founding conference of the Fourth International had about 50 members. However, as the Dutch Trotskyist periodical De Internationale reported in May 1972, this group, quote, was very isolated and weak, while up until the war the RSAP continued to number in the thousands and to have real influence among sections of the working class, end quote. The Bolshevik-Leninist group published a paper, Die Enge Weg, between February 1938 and February 1940. Most of its members lived in Rotterdam. The last years of the RSAP. With the break between the RSAP and the Fourth International, and the Dutch Party became definitively associated with the London Bureau. By that time, the remnants of the International Communist Opposition, ICO, the right opposition counterpart to Trotsky's left opposition, had also joined forces with the London Bureau. As a consequence, the periodicals of the ICO and its affiliates reported on the activities of the RSAP as a, quote, brother party, end quote. In September 1939, J. Lovestone wrote in Workers' Age, the New York periodical of the Independent Labor League, the U.S. affiliate of the ICO and London Bureau, about the RSAP's progress in recent municipal elections. Quote, we take our hats off to our brother party in Holland. In the present situation, it is a mighty achievement for revolutionary socialists to hold their own. But to score a victory in the teeth of menacing reaction, to advance the cause of militant socialism despite the fatal Stalinist betrayal of the principles and ideas of Marx and Lenin, is a victory of vital significance, end quote. The RSAP had gotten 41,000 votes, of which 17,000 had been cast in Rotterdam, as against 7,000 in the 1935 municipal poll. The RSAP had won 2 seats in the Rotterdam Council instead of the one it had before the election. With the overrunning of the Netherlands by the Nazis in May 1940, the RSAP was outlawed. In the underground, the RSAP established the Marx-Lenin-Luxemburg Front, MLL, which later changed its name to Third Front. The Orthodox Trotskyists joined Third Front. Their organization had disappeared when its principal leaders, Herman Peters and De Waal, had been arrested. In the underground, Sneevliet and his associates published the periodical Spartacus. They also brought out a number of leaflets, including works by Rosa Luxemburg. Between the February and March 1942, most of the principal leaders of the RSAP were arrested by the Nazis. 8 were condemned to death. Hendrik Sneevliet and Abraham Menist, RSAP and NAS leader in Rotterdam, Willem Doleman, leader of the pro-Fourth International group within the MLL front, Jan Schrieffer, a trade unionist, Jan Kozlag, RSAP leader in Arnhem, Cornelius Gerritsen, who committed suicide, Jan Edel, NAS leader in Alkmaar, Rein Witteweyen, printer of the group's underground publications. These people, with Gerritsen's obvious exception, were executed on April 13, 1942. At least 12 other figures in the RSAP, including the wives of several of those who were executed, were sent to jail and concentration camps by the Nazis. The disappearance of the leadership of the RSAP meant the virtual end of the party. Although some anti-Fourth International people formed the Spartacus group, it wound up, quote, in a blind alley, end quote. The RSAP was not revived after World War II. Dutch Trotskyism after the RSAP. Some of the sympathizers with the Fourth International had not left the RSAP. During the underground period after the Nazi invasion, some of these people objected to the increasingly anti-Soviet positions of Sneevliet and his associates. They were threatened with expulsion when they refused to distribute tracts equating Stalin and Hitler. The Nazi decimation of the RSAP underground apparently forestalled this move. After the arrest and execution of most of the principal leaders of the RSAP, a few of the remaining Trotskyists organized the Committee van Revolutionaire Marxisten, CRM. Starting in June 1942, it began to publish in a very rudimentary form a periodical, De Rode Oktober. When, in the summer of 1945, it became possible to send someone to try to reestablish contact with the Fourth International, Max Pertus, Perthus, one of the few survivors of the RSAP leadership, went first to Brussels, then to Paris. The provisional leadership of the Fourth International, then functioning in the French capital, recognized the CRM as the Dutch section of the FI. Fourth International. The CRM changed its name to Revolutionaire Communistische Partei in December 1945, RCP. The RCP was given a consultative seat on the International Executive Committee, IEC, of the Fourth International, which was elected at the first post-war conference of the International in Paris in March 1946. The Dutch member was given the right to a voice but not a vote in the IEC. During the more than 6 years in which the RCP existed, it never had more than 200 members. Herman Peterson has noted that it became, quote, more and more isolated in the unions through the split and downturn of the Stalinist-dominated EVC, Einheitsfach Central, Unity Trades Congress. With hardly any members in the Social Democratic NVV, end quote. Dutch Trotskyist entrism. In March 1952, the Dutch Trotskyists decided to change their strategy and experiment with, quote, entrism. In that month, it was decided that the RCP would dissolve, the Revolutionary Communist Party would dissolve, and the Revolutionary Communist Party's members entered the Netherlands Labour Party, PVDA, the post-World War II Dutch affiliate of the Socialist International. This decision was in conformity with the policy then being advocated by Michel Raptis, Pablo, the secretary of the Fourth International. Peterson has commented that, quote, the entry decision of the Dutch Revolutionary Communist Party, in 1952 is entirely parallel to the similar decision of other European sections. It was directly connected to the faction fight in the International, the Dutch decision being sped up by Pablo in order to have some initial success, end quote. As Peterson says, the Trotskyists thereupon, quote, disappeared as an independently visible force, end quote. Only about 60 of the 100 members which the Revolutionary Communist Party had early in 1952 joined the PVDA. However, according to Peterson, quote, in the first stage of the entry, everything worked well, better union work, some recruitment, and in 1954 the establishment of an opposition party, by and large dominated by the Trotskyist Sozialistische Perspektive. The Trotskyists within the Labour Party also succeeded in organizing a faction, the Social Demokratische Centrum, to which they recruited a number of other Labour Party members. In 1957, the Trotskyists established an open theoretical review, the Internationale. Their group also published internal bulletin for circulation among their own members. In 1959-60, the leadership of the Labour Party mounted a campaign against the Trotskyists. As a consequence, the latter were forced to choose between staying in the PVDA and giving up their factional group, the Social Demokratische Centrum, or withdrawing from the Labour Party. A majority decided to stay in the PVDA, the Labour Party, where for several years they were allowed to continue to publish Sozialistische Perspektive. In 1960, this faction gave up all connection with the international Trotskyist movement. Between 1965 and 1967, the group which remained within the Labour Party cooperated with the Flemish ex-Trotskyist group which remained in the Belgian Socialist Party, when most of the Trotskyists were thrown out of that party to publish Links, Left. The leader of this group was Herman Drent, Drent, who was elected to Parliament on the PVDA Labour Party ticket in the 1970s. Dutch Trotskyism since 1960. The minority of Dutch Trotskyists who continued to maintain relations with the international movement, its Pabloite faction, went on with the publication of the International Bulletin and De Internationale, both of which were abandoned by the group which stayed inside the Labour Party. Peterson has noted that De Internationale came out as a, quote, small mimeograph publication, end quote, between 1957 and 65, after which it was a printed 8-page tabloid published, quote, more or less as a monthly through 1965 to 1972, end quote. Before the split in the Trotskyist ranks, they had had considerable activity in the Ban the Bomb movement. After the split, the group remained loyal to Trotskyism. The group remaining loyal to Trotskyism was active principally in three areas. Some of their members continued to work within the Labour Party. Another group worked within a dissident communist, capital C communist group, the Sozialistische Workers' Partei, SWP. The third major field of activity was, quote, anti-imperialist work, mainly solidarity work for Algeria and later for Cuba, end quote. The SWP had been formed by a group within the Communist Party of Netherlands, which resisted efforts of the Communist Party of the Netherlands to merge the party's separate trade union group into the NVV. Quote, this conflict coincided with some Yugoslav influences on the minority, end quote. They formed the Brugge Group in 1958, quote, clearly hoping to be reintegrated with the support of the East European parties, and after some rather demoralizing experiences with the reality of Stalinism, end quote, established the Socialist Workers' Party. However, unable to offer any meaningful alternative to the Communist Party of the Netherlands, the Socialist Workers' Party, or SWP, finally dissolved in 1965, most of its remaining members joining the Pacifist Socialist Party. Meanwhile, the Trotskyist numbers and influence had declined drastically. There were perhaps 15 members left by the mid-1960s. When Michel Pablo broke with the United Secretariat in 1965-66, that what remained of the Dutch section joined forces with him. As Peterson observed, quote, by the end of the 60s, Trotskyism was at an all-time low, but through the propaganda maintained by the Pablo group, some new people were attracted to Trotskyism. This, however, did not result in significant organizational growth, end quote. In May 1972, the group around De Internationale decided to abandon Pablo's international revolutionary Marxist tendency, accusing it of, quote, moving further and further away from the international Trotskyist movement and from Bolshevism, end quote. The group resolved to join the United Secretariat. A small minority of the De Internationale group decided to stay with Pablo and recognized as the Comité van Revolutionaire Marxisten. It was still in existence in the early 1980s, but according to Peterson, it was, quote, even less Trotsky-minded than Pablo himself, end quote. In July 1972, the majority of the De Internationale group, organized as the Revolutionaire Communiste Bond, RCB, which was accepted as a sympathizing section of the United Secretariat Executive Committee. Peterson wrote that the RCB, quote, was largely composed of intellectuals and students and only a few workers without a strong union base. It did not participate in the elections, but generally called for a vote for either one of the two left-wing parties, PSP or CPM. It would probably be more correct to say that the new left upsurge had an influence on the Trotskyists in the late 60s than the other way around. Anyway, the founding of the RCB, basis for the organization of Trotskyism in this country, would have been unthinkable without the student movement in the 1960s, end quote. The RCB established relations with the Proletariat Links, proletarian left, which had recently been thrown out of the Pacifist Socialist Party. The Proletariat Links had been established in 1971, quote, after a resounding electoral defeat of the party, but it continued an older opposition current animated by some former members of the Fourth International and some left socialists. Some young people who became Trotskyists while in the PSP also participated in the group, The main planks of its platform were reorganization of the party, directing the party to the working class, elaboration of a strategy of transitional demands, end quote. The group had 25% of the delegates to the 1971 PSP Congress, but was expelled from the party in the following year. December 1974, the RCB and the Proletariat Links merged to establish the International Communisten Bond, which became the Dutch section of the United Secretariat. A few years after its establishment, it adopted a, quote, industrial, end quote, orientation, as a result of which, as Peterson reported in 1983, quote, now we have some influence in locals and factory branches of the most important union, the Industriebond, end quote. He added that, quote, by now most people joining the IKB are young workers or high school students, end quote. For the first time in 40 years, a Trotskyist organization, the IKB, participated in elections in the late 1970s. In 1978, it had candidates in most important towns in that year's provincial and municipal elections. In 1981, it had nominees throughout the country in the general election, and in the following year ran people in the Amsterdam and Rotterdam municipal polls. In the 1981 case, the IKB received a total of 1,900 votes out of 5 million. Peterson attributed this modest result principally, quote, to the pressure to give a, quote, useful, end quote, vote to one of the smaller socialist parties which were represented in most representative institutions, end quote. By 1978, the IKB had changed its name to Socialistisa Arbeiterspartei. The Socialist Workers' Party, SAP, at the time of a series of strikes by public service workers in October of that year, the SAP carried out, quote, large-scale leaflet distributions, end quote. Peterson writes that, quote, where possible, the SAP members played an active role in the action committees and worked in particular to build solidarity between the public and private sectors, ... The SAP's proposals for working toward a general strike of the public sector were generally well received, end quote. No general strike of public employees, in fact, took place. At least one other branch of international Trotskyism had at least some following in the Netherlands by the middle 1980s. Quote, comrades from the Netherlands, end quote, were reported to have attended a meeting of the International Socialist Tendency in Great Britain in September 1984. No further information is available about this group. Conclusion. By the mid-1980s, the Dutch Trotskyist movement was one of the more modest national groups in international Trotskyism. In spite of the pre-World War II importance of the RSAP, the movement had come close to the point of extinction by the mid-1960s. As in a number of other countries, the practice of, quote, entrism in the 1950s had at first resulted in substantial gains, but in the end resulted in more confusion than advances. Also, as had happened with the Trotskyist movement in several other nations, the Dutch were able to capitalize, at least to a modest degree, on the student uprising of the latter half of the 1960s. The end. Thanks for listening. Subscribe if you think about it. Or if you're thinking about it.